Welcome to the Comics Cube, everyone. Today I'm with Eddie Wright, and we are talking about the graphic novel Tyranny of the Muse. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Doing all right. Doing all right. My first question that I ask everyone is, what is it about comics that attracts you to it? What do you love about it?
Um, I love that it's like a perfect pairing of the written word and art, and for someone like me who's a writer and not an artist. I really love one of the things that I love writing most is dialogue, and comics gives you a real interesting opportunity and challenge in writing a story that where so much of the story has to be told through the dialogue, but also through um, visuals, and you have to figure out how to tell a often complicated story through visuals and through dialogue and nothing else. And obviously there are comics that use um, you know more like voiceover and things like that. But I think particularly in the book that I did, it's just this really interesting pairing of writing dialogue and figuring out how to tell a story and how to tell a story through key images, which is really interesting. Like, it's not like writing a screenplay or writing, it's where you can, while we're having a conversation, we could be cutting back and forth. You have to sort of figure out what is that key moment that you want to show to illustrate this idea right now, and then obviously work with an artist to bring that to life. It's a really interesting challenge writing comics. It's fun.
You have a particular comic that got you interested in making comics, or
Um, I read comics growing up, and I think as I entered my 20s and stuff, I definitely got into more of the indie graphic novel stuff like Daniel Klaus and Charles Burns. And I'd say that if there was anybody, it's probably, it's probably a cliche to answer at this point, but it's probably Ghost World um, and Black Hole and those books like that. Those are the ones that I really felt like they connected to me as far as the type of stories that I like to tell, and also stories that I feel like I could tell through the medium of comics. Daniel Klaus's David Boring was a big one for me when I read that. It sort of was like, oh, this is exactly what I'm into, and I feel like I can also do this. Just the writing side of it, obviously.
you're in can you who influenced you in terms of being a writer? Doesn't have to be anyone from comics.
I'd say the Philip K. Dick was a really big one. When I read A Scanner Darkly a long time ago, that was, I always wrote, but like I think when it started to click, like the types of stories that I was interested in and what writing actually could be, and the type of writing that I could do, it was definitely that book. And also Jesus' Son by Dennis Johnson was a huge influence. And when I read that, I was probably a teenager when I read that. It was like it absolutely changed the wiring in my brain as far as like how you write and the types of stories you tell, and how to sort of tell a story from like the internal perspective of a character, which is really interesting and something they try to use the character's internal life to influence the reader's um, perception of what's going on.
But what is it
Yeah.
about those books that specifically like did you take and apply to your own writing?
They grab you, like, and not necessarily like in like a thriller sense. Like they're, Jesus' Son is about a heroin addict, and it's a bunch of different stories featuring the same character, but they sort of like they get a hold of you and they make you understand their world in a pretty easy way with just word choice, with just tone. And you become sort of involved and invested in what's going on in a way that makes you feel uneasy, which I really like. It's not necessarily comforting, but it's also not so uncomfortable that you don't want to take part in it. There's also in both of those stories, and in a lot of the work from both of those writers, and Philip K. Dick in particular, there's a lot of humor that goes along with it too, a lot of dark humor, and humor that sort of naturally grows out of the story, which I really love. And that's definitely something that I've always tried to do in my own writing, is sort of merge like the weird with like the authentic, with a sense of humor that's sort of, could be a little absurd, could be but a little dry, but it's all kind of melds together in this perfect little like lived in ball of weirdness.
Speaking of speaking of the way you write and just in general the way you write, your resume, you have writing credits in all sorts of media, comics, novels, blogging, TV writing, video production. Is there a particular medium, I guess, that you're particularly most attracted to?
I think probably, I honestly like, anything involving like the fictional side of, there's obviously like, I've done a lot of different writing, whether it's copywriting for advertising or, and all of that stuff is definitely more work than it is sort of like the rewarding artistic side of things. And so I feel like comics and novels and scripts are all very different. What's nice about a novel is you can write it and it's done. You just sort of like, it's just you, and it's just you, and whatever ideas you come up with, as long as you can put them into words, they're done. And that's certainly a really nice thing. But I also really love the visual side of things. And so comics is really nice for that. But then screenwriting, like I was saying, writing dialogue and stuff like that is probably my favorite thing to do. But that's just so complicated and requires so much work and so many people and so much money to make anything happen there. So it's like, I love writing a script, but it's often a pursuit that doesn't really go anywhere, And so it's definitely like, as far as like how to feel like it's a rewarding thing to do, either novels or comics or both really, I really love doing both of them. Comics is certainly really challenging too, being a writer and not an artist, and figuring out how to best collaborate and how to best articulate the vision into a comic book script, which is, it's sort of a strange thing to write. You have to really recalibrate your brain to figure out how to write a comic scripting so that the artist clearly understands what you're going for.
Would you say then that when you're writing a script for practical purposes commercially, once you've written it, you kind of have to let it go?
For like a comic book script, you mean?
No, I'm sorry. I mean like a movie script or TV script. Like,
oh yeah, I mean, like it depends. I mean, it depends on what you're doing, right? Like you can be writing something hoping to develop it yourself, or you're writing something for hire. And that's certainly, there's a lot. There's the element of letting go is present in all kinds of writing. I think even when you're doing it solely like DIY, you still gonna have to go, that, I gotta stop, or I gotta let this go.
In 2009, you wrote and published Broken Bulbs, a novella.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe this is the basis for your current graphic novel, Tyranny of the Muse. Can you tell me how you went from what made you decide to do that as kind of an adaptation, even with a different title, instead of just adapting it as its own thing, like Broken Bulbs?
Yeah. So when I wrote Broken Bulbs, and the story of Broken Bulbs is essentially the same as Tyranny of the Muse. It's about a main character who's sort of existentially lost, and he's trying to be an artist or some semblance of an artist, and he ends up meeting a muse who supplies him with actual seeds of inspiration that get injected into his brain, and he becomes an inspiration junkie. The book is written from his point of view. So it's entirely first person. The muse character, her name is Bonnie. She's sort of just like there to help him, and she's sort of a secondary character. She's almost like dreamlike. And so when I started to develop it into a comic, which I just felt like around that time, I had started working at MTV for a comic book website that they used to have. And I was surrounded by comics a lot. And like I said, like I grew up reading comics, and they were just around all of the time. And I started to get really excited about making one and trying to make one. And so the story of Broken Bulbs just felt like it would translate really well into a comic book. It's a really visual story and has really interesting visual things that go on. And so I thought, well, if I want to make a comic, this is a good place to start because I already have a story. And then as I started developing it into a comic, it started to take on more. And in particular, the character of Bonnie became more important and became her own. She started to develop her own backstory and all this kind of stuff. And so it just developed into a different story entirely. So that's why I decided to change the title, because it's really not just like a page for page adaptation. It's sort of like Broken Bulbs is like Tyranny of the Muse in its like infancy, and then it sort of grew up into Tyranny of the Muse. So it just felt different. And I just like the title too. I thought the title just came to me one day and I just thought it sounded cool. And so I like the title Broken Bulbs too, but I think Tyranny of the Muse is cooler. Yeah, and so I just wanted it to sort of be its own thing and be a thing that I could just feel like it is a new book, and it in its comic book form is not necessarily the same as it in its prose form.
That is interesting to me because I feel like a lot of writers would have said like, no, this is the book I wrote, so this is the book we're going to adapt. But you were open to change, and I guess
Yeah,
evolution
well,
is the word. Yeah.
yeah, and like a couple of it's sort of like I'm changing with it, and I'm sort of I like, even though I put the book out in 2009, I didn't do the comic until 2012 or something like that. So that's I got interested in other stuff. It just became like I don't want to do this exact same thing again. I'm more interested in this character, or I'm more interested in this character, and I'm not necessarily just interested in making a story about this neurotic guy by himself. I got interested in balancing him with other types of characters and expanding the story.
Yeah, that's interesting to me too because I feel like as a reader, as a fan, I see that a lot when people talk about adaptations. Like why did they change stuff? And I'm like, if I wanted the exact same story, I would just read the original story. Right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a different medium. Like it's you have to tell stories different ways depending on the medium that you're using. So whether it's being adapted into a comic or into a movie or into a TV show, things have to change just by the nature of what they are and what they become.
You think it's easier to do a first-person story in prose than in comics, just by nature of having to draw the person
Yeah, I think
themselves?
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you end up like, because first person narratives in prose are, that's the structure, like the words on the page are this character's thoughts. And so when you translate that into a comic book is naturally, like, at least to me, it feels more like a third person medium because you're looking at the character. You're not necessarily inside the character's head the way you would be in a book. And so therefore you end up with, and people have successfully done this plenty of times, but you end up with a comic that's got big blocks of, you know, uh, like monologue, inner dialogue from the main character, because they're talking you through everything that's going on. And I just feel like that's a lot of words for a thing that's got a lot of pictures. Yeah.
Yeah, that's commendable because I grew up reading comics in the 80s, and I've seen writers try to put words over beautiful pictures.
Yeah, it's particularly in the 80s, it's pretty common. And people do it and they do it successfully and it works.
Yeah.
I feel like it all probably works a little bit better, at least as far as I know. Like if you, for someone who's a writer and artist, a cartoonist, who's actually doing everything themselves, they probably would do a better job of putting that together than me handing a script over.
Yeah, they're not going to get in their own way.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you've basically said what Broken Bulbs is about, but just for the sake of everyone watching, What is Tyranny of the Muse? Elevator pitch. What is it about, and what drew you to make it?
So it's about a character named Frank Fisher who is sort of a lost creative type, um, and meeting a uh, he ends up getting involved with a company that um, supplies him with what is essentially his own personal muse, and she gives him a chemical form of inspiration that gets injected into his brain through a festering wound on his forehead. And so the story follows both this character, Frank, and his muse, whose name is Bonnie. And as the story develops, you learn that Bonnie used to be an artist herself and was an actual muse for an artist, and you sort of go into how she got involved into the with this organization. That wasn't a very good elevator pitch, by the way. I'll get one down. I'll do better. But and so the story sort of developed. Uh, I just thought it was an interesting idea. You know, when like you have a creative idea and you sort of get really excited about it, and you're like, this is the one, this is the story that I'm going to tell, or this is the project I'm going to do, and I love it so much, and you get all like you get jazzed up, and you sort of like have this, you get energized, and then maybe you start working on it, or maybe you think about it a little bit more, and you start to kind of come down from that high, and you're like, well, this is the stupidest idea I've ever had, this is horrible. Or you start working on it and you're like, this is trash, I'm horrible, I'm meaningless, I'm nothing. And then like I just thought, wouldn't it be something if you could just sort of keep getting that feeling? And what would happen if you could just keep getting that feeling of inspiration? And I thought like, well, there's you could do uphill, and that's certainly the easy way to go. And I just thought it would be a little bit more interesting if the inspiration was actually injected into your brain. And then I really like the idea of this character not only having it injected into his brain, but no one's really sealed it up for him. No, it's not a very official process. It's ugly and it's messy. Um, and I just thought like the idea of a muse as a drug dealer, as opposed to someone who's just sort of there inspiring the artist, was interesting. And it all became very relatable as a creative person,
Yeah.
to tell the story about somebody who's just constantly chasing inspiration. And sort of throughout the story, Frank is sort of compulsively returning to the same project over and over and over again, and he really doesn't understand why, and he doesn't want to, because it sort of scares him to keep going back to this project. And I thought that was really relatable as well, because I think that there are these things that creative people and artists feel compelled to make, and like maybe they don't want to, and every new injection of inspiration, you're hoping that maybe I'll actually have a different idea that will be just as exciting and just as interesting, and I'll want to go for that one. But you just keep coming back to this one, and you kind of and it might make you uncomfortable, and it might make you sad or whatever, but you have to do it, and you're compelled to do it. um, and I thought that was also just interesting and relatable too.
Yeah, I was gonna say how much of this is autobiographical tonally.
I mean, like, a story about a creative guy who is an existential wreck is certainly like pretty much, it's as relatable and as personal of a story as I could tell. But there's a lot of elements in the story that are semi autobiographical. A lot of the stuff in Frank's background, but a lot of it is, it's fiction, but it's all like, I think a writer writing a story about a guy writing a story is in and of itself going to be a little autobiographical, whether I want it to be or not.
Yeah, it becomes a character study for Frank, and I was one. Yeah, and
Hmm.
I'm not going to ask how much of that reflects your own background, but you did mention that Bonnie evolved
Hmm.
in the course of this graphic novel. Uh, What prompted that evolution?
I think she just became a little bit more interesting to me. She became probably because I wrote the book, and the book is from Frank's point of view, um, and like I said, like I'm certainly I find him to be a really relatable character in a lot of ways. Some, hopefully not all, hopefully not that much, but um, Bonnie just I think became a character who's sort of outside of my own perspective a little bit, and I found her to be a little bit more interesting than Frank as I developed this into a graphic novel, and I really felt like I didn't want her to be simply like the manic pixie dream girl trope of like this magical girl comes and helps an erotic guy break out of his shell, like that sort of thing. And I think that's probably what she was in the original version of the story. And I didn't want her to be. And I thought using this her job of being a muse and also her past of being an actual muse for her artist boyfriend, I thought that was sort of an interesting thing to explore. Like, muses are inherently a manic pixie dream girl, right? They're there in service of the artist. And sort of what does that mean to be someone who doesn't really have their own agency? They're just sort of there to do a job. And I think that throughout the story, she's very reluctant and she feels guilty. And I think there was just a lot to dig into with her. Um, yeah, and I really like her as a character too. I think she's fun and she's fun to write.
You mentioned that there's a 3-year gap between the publication of Broken Bulbs and the start of
Mhm.
Tyranny of the Muse.
Yeah.
Is that did the change that you made to Bonnie, did that come to you in that 3-year gap, or while you were making the graphic novel?
It started in the 3 year, not quite. It started there, but then as the graphic novel developed further, it became more and more about her. And Frank's story was kind of always what Frank's story was. I mean, the story ends differently than the novella does, but um, as I worked on the graphic novel, it was definitely like I put a lot more work into Bonnie's story. Yeah.
Speaking of putting work into the story, 2012, you you obviously have an artist for this. It's Dave
Mhm.
Chisholm. Uh, how did you get to get? What made Dave the right artist? How did you get together with him?
Yeah. So actually, when this project first started, there was a different artist on it, um, and we actually did 2 issues of of a comic book series. So this book has been a saga, but so I did a Kickstarter for the original to so I could pay the artist and so we could pay to print it and all that kind of stuff. Um, and so the Kickstarter was successful, and I worked with an artist named Jesse Balmer. Um, and so we started working on it as a graphic novel, but just based on in the interest of time, we decided to take it from a graphic novel to individual issues of a comic. And so Jesse and I did 2 issues of Tyranny of the Muse. And then he, got busy with other stuff. He was working on other projects. He just he started working in animation. So he wasn't able to do the book anymore. And that's when I found Dave. And so I was just kind of looking around. I don't remember where I found him, but I was just somewhere on the internet. And I saw a drawing that he did. And it just, the colors were really interesting and the style was really cool. And it just seemed like it would make a lot of sense with this story. And it was very different from what Jesse was doing. His work was way more experimental and
Yeah,
way more psychedelic, like especially the interiors, like and so Dave's style is like it's interesting and it's dynamic and it can be experimental and it can be a little psychic, like particularly the covers. The cover of Tyranny of the Muse is like a nice bold colors and really interesting, but it's also a little bit more it's cleaner. And so it was definitely a slightly different approach to the story, but I still thought it made a lot of sense. And it was, I think, the right art to sort of take the story to the next level that I wanted it to go. And so he ended up doing 3 more issues of the book as individual issues. And then a couple of years back, I
During the pandemic.
decided during the pandemic, yeah, I was, looking for something to do like everybody else. And I was like, would you be interested in actually just doing this thing as a graphic novel and not continuing to do issues, but let's just like stop doing the issues, do a book, and then actually redraw the first couple of chapters of the story. Not necessarily redraw, but go back to the script and draw your own.
Remaster. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like have Dave do his own take on the first couple chapters of the story. And so I rewrote a bunch. And that's when I filled in all of these gaps. I finished the story. And then as I was writing, he was drawing, and we ended up finishing it earlier this year. And so it's sort of like it became what I wanted it to be from the beginning, and so he's just been just an awesome partner to work with on this. Like his work is amazing. And he's also stuck with it, which has been a huge, really important for me, because this thing has been going on. Like I said, it started in 2012. He started working on it in 2014, something like that, 2015. And so he's been doing it for 7 years. And we've just been working slowly, and both of us have gone off and done things. And, I moved several times. I've moved across the country multiple times. I've had different jobs. And same with him. I don't know about moving, but we just sort of, we just kept doing it and kept plugging away slowly but surely, until eventually we finished it. And it's, I'm really happy with how it came out, and that's what I wanted it to be from the beginning.
Very cool. What did it feel like to finally get it finished?
It felt weird. Like it was, I don't know, it was weird. It's been so long, and in a lot of ways it's still not, it's finished. The story's finished. It's drawn, it's done, it's in a book, and it's out, but it's still like, it's so much work trying to get people to read it, getting, talking about it, getting it, like, so it feels like I'm still part of it. I'm still doing it, even though I'm done writing it. It's still this project that is ongoing, and it's just sort of, it's just this very slow moving thing that's just kind of going and becoming whatever it is that it's becoming.
Comics where creators are their own marketing team.
Seriously.
How I'm a little surprised that you mentioned that you were drawn to Dave's artwork because of the color. So what was the reasoning to not color this book?
It started out black and white, and it feels like a black and white comic. It's not even, it never even came up that we would color it. It's just, that's just how it was. And I don't know, I like black and white comics. I like color.
Yeah.
I like comics in color too, but it just always felt like, I mentioned, like, Black Hole and stuff like that. I probably just had all that in my mind while I was working on it, and it just never even crossed my mind that it would be in color.
The work knows what it wants to be. So
Yeah, it just feels like it. Feels like a black and white story.
was this story cathartic for you? Seeing as how it is about a creative person.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know about cathartic. It's definitely it's relatable, but I don't know if I felt like I was getting anything out of I think, like, the act of making things is cathartic, but not necessarily the story. Just the act of creating art or doing something is its own form of catharsis. But like, I usually feel good when something's done, but I often feel really bad when I'm making it, and so, like, it's hard to be like, good, thank. I feel cleansed now. It's sort of just like, oh, well, that was horrible. And this thing, like, it's constant. It's a constant spiral. And so, I don't know. It's hard to call anything cathartic.
Without spoiling anything for anyone, would you say that the ending of Tyranny of the Muse is a happy ending?
Um, no, maybe. Well, I would say sort of. There's a little bit of there's a kind of hopeful. I would say it's a kind of hopeful ending is what I would call it.
A door is open.
A door is open, definitely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's something's gonna happen. You know, certainly not a tragedy. I'll say that. It's definitely, and it's definitely not a, oh, everything's fine. Problems are solved. It's definitely like, maybe it's a few steps on the way to the problem being solved.
What that is something that I did notice because I feel like it does share the kind of tone as something, towards the end, as something like Ghost World, where you don't know what might happen. And
Mhm.
what is it about ending a story that way that is attractive to you?
I think when everything is all buttoned up, it's just not interesting to me. It depends on the story. Like, I think if it's like a thriller that's like really tightly twisty and everything, and you sort of want like, okay, they got the killer, or like this thing like you want it to be buttoned up and tight at the end. But I think this type of story where things are messy, and unusual, you don't want it to end with a definitive kind of the end, everybody's fine now, they all lived happily ever after. I just think that would be really inauthentic and not true, and not honest, because like I think no matter what happens in these characters' lives, nothing's ever going to feel 100% okay for them. It's just going to get to a place where it's like, okay, I'm here now, and maybe this is better than where I was.
And we can deal with it. I have a So one of the things that I really like about this book is, and this is something that I really do like about Dave's work in general, is that Dave knows how to transition from one thing to another.
Hmm.
So whenever we go into the story in Frank's head, we know we know that without us being told that, because we see it because it's on that ripped out
Yeah, on
sketchbook
paper.
paper.
Hmm.
Uh, what was the collaboration process like with Dave when it came to these visual flourishes?
Yeah, that's that kind of, that specific detail that you're talking about, where it's like a ripped out notebook paper, that came directly from him. And there's definitely like a lot of that kind of stuff, these sort of artistic framing or visual framing devices, or ways to transition from one thing to the next, definitely came from him. And that's sort of, the way I wrote the script. I kept sort of visual direction. I tried, like I said before, like I tried to make it as clear as possible, and I tried to articulate the tone and the rhythm of what I wanted to be happening, but also there was a lot of room for him to get in there and work and sort of develop something his own way. Um, Whether it was like from the number of panels onto a page, maybe I put too many panels, which is something that I could do just because I write a lot of dialogue and characters talk a lot. And so I'd be like, oh, I have to go back and forth. And it's like, he can't draw 85 panels on one page. That would be insane. So like he could, he would reach out to me and say, is it cool if I change the panel layout on this? Or if I do fewer, if I put one extra here, is that cool? Like, he would do stuff like that. Or he'd be like, I have an idea for this. It's going to look really cool. And then he would maybe do a thumbnail or do pencils and show it to me, and then I'd give feedback on it. There were certain parts of the book where it's just sort of like I would send him the script, he would just do it. There are other times where he would thumbnail it out specifically. We'd talk about it. I'd give feedback on it, and then he would go to pencils. He'd give it to me. I'd give feedback on it. It depends, like there were times where he'd be like, "Is it cool if I just go, directly to pencils on this and not show any thumbnails?" Because like he had a good handle on it. Um, so it was really like it was a really collaborative process, and I think there was a lot of, I trusted him to do
Yeah.
an awesome job on it. But yeah, those little things, like, I'm happy that you noticed those, that kind of stuff. I remember when he first did it, and I remember I was like really literal and annoying. I was like, because like the notebook that Frank has, there's a big splash page where he's laying there and he's got the notebook on his chest, and the page, it's like a notebook that has the spiral on the side. And I and the but the page that the way he drew it, the page is at the rip part is at the top of the page, and I was like, do you think it's weird that it's that way? And he's like, no, like it's gonna be that's fine. It's like it's just a visual device. It's okay, like, so it was those moments where he's like, just take it easy, you don't have to be that literal about it. Like, people will understand what this means, just because it's on the side on one thing doesn't mean it can't be on the top over here. And so it's that kind of stuff where I'd be like, okay, you're right.
Yeah, there are sketchbooks like that. So
Yeah, it's like it's just a device to break up the
yeah,
to show you we are now in a story within the story,
that's great.
and
You
it works.
trust your artist. That is awesome.
I mean, you have to, right? Like, I'm not an artist, I'm only the writer. So like, how could I possibly make a comic book without trusting this person? I can't do it. Like, if I could do it myself, I probably would have,
Yeah.
but like, I can't. So you have to, like we said, you have to let go. And it's not even really letting go. It's bringing it to life. It's realizing it to its full potential.
How can people order or buy Tyranny of the Muse?
Um, tyrannyofthemuse.com is a website, and they could get it in print and digital there. It's available. You can get copies directly from me through there. You could also get it on Kindle through a website called Lulu. But yeah, that's the best place to get it. It'll probably be in other places soon, but I'm working on that.
And what's next for Eddie Wright?
I don't know. I have several ideas, and I'm trying to figure out what they are. I started writing something. I don't really know what it is yet. I have an idea for a sequel to this, but I don't know if I want to do that or not. Right now, I'm sort of figuring out what the project is. I have a lot of ideas, and I often sort of like start on things and see if I could just keep it going. And yeah, some of them are like some of the ideas are very big. Some of them are smaller. One might be a comic. One might be a nonfiction story. I don't know. It's something.
It's interesting. It's tempting to do a sequel to something open-ended, right? Because you don't. It's right there, but at the same time, do you want to answer that question? Do you want to answer the unanswered questions?
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm going through. It's like, it's sort of, it ends, it's done, but there's a lot to, like, it's a really rich world, and so there's a lot to dig into, and I have ideas of how to, but I don't know, we'll see. But yeah, I haven't fully figured out what the next project is yet.
You did just release a novel, A Broken Everything. Is that related to Broken Bulbs?
No, I just really like the word broken. I guess it has nothing to do. Honestly, it is a little related. It's a story about a writer who discovers that his estranged father has died, and he's left him his house. And when he moves into the house, he finds that his father was working on a sort of a new age manifesto / detective story. And so he feels like he should finish the book, and it's sort of his way of getting to know his father. But the story sort of takes place in multiple realities, where the story that he's writing is in the book, and his story, and then also the writer wrote a bunch of, he self-published a book of stories that he wrote when he was 8 years old. And so you read the stories that he wrote as an 8-year-old too, and all three of those things sort of come together. And so something that's actually really interesting, I don't know if it's interesting, but there's one of the stories that he wrote when he is 8 years old is the same story that the character in Frank's story reads to his class in Tyranny of the Muse. So like, I'm not sure why I did that, but I did that.
So it
So
is
it is,
related.
it is kind of related, but not really. Like, it doesn't, like, it's not like Bonnie shows up in the other story. I just did that because I thought it was fun. Um, but yeah, it's another sort of existential absurdist story about a creative person struggling. So it's similar, but A Broken Everything is far more surreal and weird than Tyranny of the Muse.
How weird is it to write a story within a story within a story within a story?
It's really weird, but it's weird, but it sort of feels very natural to me. I'm really interested in how fictional ideas where fictional ideas come from, and I think that's something that I tried to put into Tyranny of the Muse. Like, why do we write these things, or why do we make up these things, and how do they evolve into the fictional versions of themselves? Like, this thing happened in your life, and now you're writing a story about it. And is the story going to be exactly what happened in your life, or is it going to be a weird, strange, surreal version of that? And so I think, like, I always tend to think about things in multiple layers. It's never really just like a character wakes up in the morning and does a thing, and then this happens and this happens and this happens. It's usually like the character does a thing, and then he sits and thinks about how much that thing matters and what the meaning of this thing is, and then we go into his thoughts about that thing, and then that, I don't know. I like layers. I think they're interesting.
Tyranny of the Muse is available on tyrannyofthemuse.com and all of the other links that we will place below this video. Thank you, Eddie. This was great.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.